Vulnerable Mission, Migration, Inclusion and Diversity, Radical Islam by Jim Harries. Depending on which side you're on, you may recently have heard a lot of alarming accounts regarding a deep, widespread and apparently unstoppable hatred by Muslims of Jews. The way in which social media these days panders to people's preferences, I'm assuming that if your internet clicking identifies you as a supporter of the Palestinian justification for the 7th October attack on Israel, then you may not have been receiving the above. The issue of Muslim hatred for Jews surfaces some deep and wide differences of opinion regarding on how to do inclusion and diversity. On the one hand, for the sake of inclusion and diversity, there's long been a major effort to allow people to speak for themselves. Hence the notion in the West that if you want to know about Islam, ask a Muslim. Yet one might wonder how honest some Muslims will be, or even can be, if asked to explain the kinds of things they believe and do. Then one might wonder how one is to discover truth about the actual way of life of Muslims. There's a question of honesty. How honest might people be? It might seem strange to ask Muslims whether they hate Jews, or even what they think about Jews. Such could be taken as a leading question. When the issue is immigration into the West, one would most likely not expect immigrants to voluntarily identify any issue which risks putting them at loggerheads with an administration that is considering their eligibility. Any hatred for Jews is likely to remain below the surface. There's also the question of how honest people can be. Honesty may be impossible. To consider this carefully, let us think more laterally than usual about differences between ethnicities. Let us imagine ethnicities to parallel some popular sports, like soccer and tennis. That is, one ethnicity plays tennis, another plays soccer. One has a culture of tennis playing, another has a culture of soccer playing. The differences between soccer and tennis here represent the differences between their cultures. Let us imagine a tennis player being asked a question by a soccer player. They could be asked a question like, what do you consider to be the best strategy to avoid being found offside? Or they could be asked, who have been your best goal scorers? Now, to reverse that, a tennis player might ask a soccer player to explain what happens when their ball goes out. Or a tennis player could ask a soccer player to tell the kind of racket he prefers. These questions make honest answering impossible. Now, the above illustrates difficulties that arise when one wants people to speak for themselves in relation to others who are different. An added level of difficulty would be present if people listening to those who've been asked to speak for themselves are unaware of the difficulties in intercultural, i.e. intersport, in our example, communication I've already alluded to. Such people could simply assume what they're being told to be true. Now, when I say true, I mean true according to their own perspective. Let's look at the above examples in this respect. Muslims denying that they hate Jews may easily result in the assumption that they would be as much opposed to anti-Semitism as are typical native Brits. Muslims not raising issues that could produce value clashes if they live in the West can lead to the assumption that there will be no such clashes. Let us compare this with some sport examples. A tennis player who does not want to be perceived as being ignorant might tell us that careful awareness of the white lines surrounding the serving areas will help to avoid being offside. Similarly, a soccer player saying that a ball that goes out should be recovered. I present these topical issues here as a way of pointing to a radical relevance of what we call vulnerable mission principles to contemporary global issues. These principles are that some key informers to the West of what is going on around the world and amongst other ethnicities should be Western people who have had long-term exposure to majority world, maybe Arab world, Asian, African, etc. contexts. In that long-term exposure, they should preferably entirely interact with local people using their own indigenous languages and resources. Those with that kind of exposure are the people who will be able to acquire a deep appreciation of the ways in which contextual differences affect communication. They are, as a result, the ones the West should be listening to. They should not listen to them as their native, to the people the West wants to understand. They're clearly not. Nor should they listen to them because they explain things like simply, or in a pleasing way. One should listen to them because they can engage with, rather than ignore, some very real communication and translation issues of the nature that we have mentioned and articulated above. The global education industry needs some adjustment if it is to do inclusion and diversity. For a start, languages used in education should be those that are already native to students. This implies a need for translation to underlie international sharing of knowledge. Principal translators should be members of populations receiving new knowledge. One could add many related areas of concern. Many people these days migrate to Europe and America for reasons of economics and security. This will inevitably result in there being many who might have very different values to those of the indigenous people. Some may be unwilling or unable to adjust to their host's values. That is to say, for example, immigrant Muslims may bring values that run at loggerheads with those of indigenous people. This raises potentially very difficult issues. I would like to examine the policy of inclusion and diversity with regards to this. Many European countries like to be open to a lot of ethnic diversity. In order to fulfill this, they may, as a matter of immigration policy, endeavour not to be partial with regards to someone's ethnicity, race, religion, culture, and so on. At the same time, the enormous economic and related benefits people can acquire through gaining citizenship of a European country draws many to immigrate. Such incentive will result in bogus truth claims. Talking to people is unlikely to reveal their values and ways of life. The latter will to a large extent depend on where and by whom they've been raised. Yet if ethnicity is not to be used as a criterion for admission or otherwise into Europe, and the best benefits of immigration into Europe remain enormous, it will be hard to prevent people from coming en masse. There seem to be two possible solutions. One, control immigration according to people's culture, religion and lifestyle. In this case, discovery of their lifestyle will require the practice of vulnerable mission by people indigenous to Europe. Or two, prevent immigrants from benefiting from wealth-producing possibilities that are there in Europe. Otherwise, when incentives are high, so will be the number of people determined to come, and so there is likely to be concealing of truth. The massive size of rewards being attainable through illegal immigration really in many ways are immoral. They leave little else worth living for, i.e. outside of Europe. All people of means spend their strength in trying to link to Europe. Some people these days wonder why the West has recently opened its doors very widely to Muslim immigrants. There are no doubt many reasons for this. One reason is because of the massive ongoing impact of Christianity in Western nations. Thus an openness to visitors reflects a Christian ethic that all people are inherently valuable as are made in the image of God. The Bible tells us to love even our enemies. If one loves one's enemies, then one no longer has enemies. This is a reason for the West's contemporary open-door immigration policies. A difficulty being faced in contemporary times is that many immigrants have ways of life that are quite antagonistic to what some are calling Western values. More liberal and atheistic people in the West have believed that such people will see sense when they come to Europe and take European values on board. Many of them, particularly those following teachings of Muhammad, have been slow to do this. Their ways of life are very resistant to such flexibility. Not all Western people have been very aware of this resistance. I've pointed out difficulties faced in the West learning from the other in contemporary times. An implicit assumption has been that people from around the world will accurately and truthfully articulate themselves when they come to the West. Yet the benefits, especially financial, of life in the West are often so enormous that there are many who justify bending the truth in order to get a foot in the door. Enormous difficulties in intercultural communication, some of which I've already discussed, further prevent clear mutual understanding. Adding to the difficulty, many places from which immigrants emerge have not been very open to Western people living with them. Perhaps there ought to have been a reciprocal agreement, like something like this. Immigrants from the rest of the world will only be accepted from countries that welcome immigrants from the West. There's a reverse difficulty associated with all this. That is that as immigrants into the West can disrupt Western communities in ways not locally appreciated, so also can the reverse movement. The nature of impacts is different, however. Western people are loved in many parts of the world. A mistake, though, I think they often make. They're consistently travelling with power. They consistently seek to use the advantages they have as residents of powerful Western countries to force their influence onto their hosts. They justify this on the basis that it is charitable action motivated by compassion. On the surface, as they need the money, such hosts may very much appreciate this. Deeper down, however, many do not appreciate being dominated by foreigners who do not profoundly understand them. A related reason Westerners have not moved en masse to the places from which migrants are these days coming is that they've seen little lifestyle benefit from doing so. There's an ilk of Western people who will, however, and do intentionally travel so as to immerse themselves amongst the poor and those who believe differently than they do. These are Christian missionaries. They do this so as to share the good news of Jesus. In the course of doing so, if they sidestep the domination I've just mentioned, they can, over many years, acquire a deep comprehension of the lives of the people they're reaching. That comprehension ought to be of value to decision makers on issues concerning globalization and migration back at home in the West. An important way forward to the world today is serious encouragement of Christian mission by Western people to all corners of the world. Some of those missionaries who go should avoid dominating the people they seek to reach by rooting their ministries in indigenous languages and resources. The life experiences and feedback provided by such missionaries can facilitate intercultural relationship in a way that can help to encourage healthy inclusion and diversity even within the West itself. Without their guidance, policymakers tend to operate blindly. As a part of this and related processes, the West ought to recognize the key importance of maintaining a position in which their primary foreign policy objective should be to share the good news of Jesus with others around the world. Thus the objective comes to be to transform people's hearts, to bring peace, love and the sharing of the grace of God wherever the West has an influence. To reiterate, global engagement should be done using the languages and resources of the people being reached, a practice known as vulnerable mission.